Hmm. So V, this person you banned from the show. And so I don't know if you want to take them or if you just want to take somebody else.
Well, here's the thing. A ban is up to interpretation. And I know that you have been wanting to engage.
I have.
So,
but as since we're doing this equally,
I appreciate
we're equally
you
yoked. If you say
checking
this
in.
person's banned, then they're banned.
I am very interested to see if they have made any amount of leeway in their arguments, or if we're going to hear
just the same thing.
The same thing, but one way or another.
I think we'll get an interesting call.
Let's talk to Robin in DC.
Robin, the statement is, neutrality towards God is impossible as God is metaphysically primary. Robin, you're live with Eric and V.
Yeah. Do you guys? Thanks for taking my call. Do you guys agree with that statement?
So I don't understand when you say metaphysically primary. I understand metaphysics. I understand the word primary, but when you put those two together, I'm not yet on board. Could you explain that a bit?
Yeah. God is defined as, in this conception, as that which is ultimate and the mind, and so God would just be that which all things derive and depend upon. And so that's what I take metaphysically primary to mean. All things have their foundation in God.
Why is that different than necessary, or are you just using the words interchangeably?
Well, no, it's different from necessary because necessary doesn't necessarily have to deal with metaphysics.
Well,
like you can say something's necessarily true. I mean,
you're talking about ontology.
Of course, there's a metaphysical reality, but I'm talking about when I say God is metaphysically primary, or he's at that metaphysical context, we're talking about, ultimately speaking, what everything derives and depends upon.
Okay, so when you say ultimate in the mind, can you kind of see where I'm a little confused there?
All I'm using mind to mean is that it's conscious, as awareness. So in eternity past, God would be entirely self-conscious.
Okay, so when you're saying the mind, you're not talking about all people's minds. You're talking about something else. When like in big quotes,
our
capital
minds,
the mind.
Property of being conscious.
Okay, I feel like I'm getting more in the mud here, and I'm wondering, am I cutting you off too quickly? I still don't understand, and I really want to try here. When you say something is primary or ultimate in the mind, I think you just responded that just means that God has a mind, but also that it's in all of our minds.
Oh no, I didn't say ultimate in the mind. I don't know if that's what your call screener wrote down. I said ultimate and a mind. It's ultimate and a mind.
No, I misheard you. Actually, the call screener didn't write that down. Ultimate and a mind. Okay, so
yeah.
Oh my gosh, now we have way more room to work with. Thank you for clarifying. Okay, so I know that we've talked about the mind a bit before, that I don't think a mind can exist without a body. And I don't know if there's a whole lot more meat on the bone on that. But ultimate kind of does, it makes me curious. Like my understanding and my use of...
Look, I mean, what I called for is just, I want to make a case for why you cannot be neutral.
Sure.
That's not really relevant as to what I believe as to whether or not God exists. Like,
well,
I could believe that, I could be an atheist and believe that God does not exist. I could still make the case that I'm presenting here either way, because all this talking about is whether or not you can be neutral.
The concern here, though, is we do want to get to your main point and your main question, but you come on the show and you throw a whole bunch of words that seem a little word salady at us and say, do you agree? And we're not going to agree with something unless we know exactly what you mean by it. So that's where we got off track. If you want to get directly to the question, just ask the question in a way we can understand it.
Yeah, it's not understanding what you mean when you talk about things like ultimate. We're just going to talk past each other, and it's not useful.
Well, did I not just define it? Is it not clear to you now what ultimate means?
No.
So ultimate, again, just means that all things derive and depend upon God. So in this case, when I say God is ultimate, I'm saying all things derive and depend upon God, and that God is entirely and non-conditionally, he's not contingent upon anything.
Okay. So you're saying that all things depend upon God. So how do we determine that?
That's not. I'm just dealing with the definition. It's not whether or not we determine that God exists. Again, like this. So my point is not to make the argument that God exists to you. That's not what I called for. I can do that, but that's not. I mean, that would just be like a side issue.
Well, so here's the thing: is your definitions imply that a God exists and that a God has to exist for us to use those definitions. Mm-hmm. Because if
a definite like Superman doesn't have to exist in order for us to define Superman. Like a definition is entirely different from a claim that something exists. All I'm doing right now is defining a term because you said you didn't understand what it meant.
Right, and baked into that is the idea that a God is non-conditional.
So are you asking us that...
No, nothing's baked into anything. All I'm doing is defining a term.
You're defining how you...
For nothing else and nothing else would you be saying this, right? You don't say that for us to watch the movie Marvel that Iron Man exists now because they've defined Iron Man in a certain way with certain properties.
Unless you
all
say...
I've done right now is define God. And
Robin.
Me defining God is necessary. I could define Iron Man as necessary. That doesn't mean that Iron Man exists. I'm not claiming that Iron Man exists.
If the definition of Iron Man means that he necessarily exists, then yes, saying I agree with the definition of Iron Man suggests we agree that he necessarily exists.
Yeah,
no. Because, for example, in Islam, okay, many Muslims in the Quran would say that Allah is necessary. That is not. I don't have to believe that Allah exists in order for me to accept the definition of Allah or one of his properties.
So what you're asking us, do we accept that you define God in this way?
Yeah, that's all we're talking about is definitions here. When we said that God is ultimate, we're just defining God. That is not asking you to accept that he exists or that he's necessary. It's just a definition that God is the foundation of all things that exist metaphysically. I'm not asking you to accept it.
I would accept that you define God that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So now are all the terms defined now? So now when I say that you cannot be neutral towards God, we understand what that means?
We cannot be neutral towards your definition of God.
Yeah. Do you accept that?
Accept what exactly? That we cannot be neutral towards your definition of God?
Yeah.
I think we can be convinced or unconvinced.
Well, that's not an answer to the question. By neutrality, I mean that you neither hold a position that God exists or does not exist. So somebody who claims to be neutral would say, I'm agnostic. I neither affirm nor deny God's existence, as he's just been defined. Do you believe that you can be neutral towards God?
Well, you just used a really great example, an agnostic. I've met plenty of agnostics who say that determining whether or not a God exists is not possible. It's absolutely
it's not
impossible.
Dependent on a definition. It's impossible.
Yeah, and so for somebody to say, I think determining whether or not a God exists was, if they said that it was entirely impossible, then I would say that person's taking a neutral position because their statement, what they're saying is that they think it's not, that there is no way to get to an answer to them.
Okay. Well, I would say that the definition is actually relevant because the whole point is that there are certain categories of things that you cannot be neutral towards as opposed to categories of things that you can be neutral towards.
Ooh, what are these categories? What are these categories of things we can't be neutral towards?
Well, one of the categories is what we're talking about right now. God is that which is a metaphysical.
Oh, you do this every time. You do this every time, Robin. Every time I ask you. What am I doing? You are creating whole categories of things that just exist, right? This is just one thing in a category of things we can't be neutral about.
I don't know.
You can't be neutral. So I'll give you another example.
Perfect.
You cannot be neutral towards the fact that you are that you're experiencing things or that you're alive. You can't be neutral towards that.
Neutral meaning accepting or not accepting?
No, neutral meaning that you neither affirm nor deny the proposition. That you're alive right now, that you're experiencing things, or that you're look. Bottom line is okay.
Well, no.
Even if I'm just coming up,
Robin.
Bottom line,
Robin.
Okay.
Robin.
You could say that I'm coming up with this proprietary category.
Actually, no, Robin.
Either what I'm saying is true, and I have a justification for it, or it's not true. What I want to know is if you agree with what I'm saying already, then I don't have to give my justification. But if you don't agree, and I'm glad to unpack why I'm holding to the position I hold to.
Robin.
Which is why I'm asking you, do you agree with my statement?
You had a good point earlier. It took me a minute, not because I was angry, but because I was mulling over what you were saying.
Yeah, thank you for providing something else in that category. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah, you're trying to wrap it back around, but I kind of want to give you kudos. Like, you did a thing, we asked for it, and now I'm taking a second to chew on it. So, can I be neutral about my own experience? Are there lots of things in this category?
Not really.
Well, no. Are there lots of?
I feel like you're getting sidetracked because it's not really
sidetracked from.
You could say I can't be neutral towards that. That's fine. What I'm here to argue, okay? Because you could say that other part is debatable. I'm here to. I have the case. I have a justification for specifically what I'm talking about right now, which is neutrality towards God. Okay.
Okay.
That's what I have. That's what I'm willing right now to justify to you. The other issue is just a side example, which is I wouldn't find it to be too controversial, but that's a side issue. Okay?
Right, but do you get why it's important to unpack that first in order to convince us of this other thing that you're trying to get across?
No, it's not. It's not necessary to provide you other examples if I'm willing right now to justify my claim to you that God is not something you can be neutral towards. I don't need to justify that you cannot be neutral towards you having experiences in order for me to justify that you cannot be neutral towards God.
So it was a useless comparison to make in the first place?
Well, you asked me to give other categories, and that's why I did. But that's not really necessary because I'm willing to make the case right now for what I stand for, which is that you cannot be neutral towards God.
Okay.
I'm willing to do that, which is why I've been asking you now.
Right.
At least 3 or 4 times if you agree with my statement so I can move forward.
Robin.
In justifying it.
Robin, the way you're putting that, it sounds like you think we're pettifogging you. Is that what you think?
What do you say?
Pettifogging. That we're getting, it was a word that was used in the last episode and I can't stop using it. That we're being so focused on definitions that we're preventing the conversation from moving forward. That it might be an active ploy for us to not move forward.
I don't think you're. I think these are definitions that are important to understand, but I have laid them out already at this point.
Sure.
So,
and
at this point, I just want to get to the justification for my position.
Go for it. Justify it. Why do you think it's impossible to be neutral towards your definition of God?
Because everyone has a metaphysical framework if they're operating intelligently in the world. That when I predicate. When I'm operating within the world, I'm just making decisions about things. I'm comparing things.
Hey, Robin, real quick. I think you may have gotten a call and while you were saying that. Can you go back and say that again, please? You cut out.
Oh, yes. I said that everyone who's operating meaningfully and and intelligibly in the world is going to require that they are operating within the context of a metaphysical framework, meaning that they're operating with a foundational sense as to what does it mean for things to be true or false, possible or impossible, what is the fundamental relationship between facts. If you don't have an answer to those kind of questions, you're not operating in the world meaningfully. Like you wouldn't be predicating meaningfully or making decisions about things or comparing things meaningfully without a metaphysical framework that you're operating under.
Can someone be wrong with that? Like the way you described it, determining whether or not something is true or false. My first thought is, like a personal Jiminy Cricket, somebody who says this is wrong, but in my worldview, the way that I understand things, people can be wrong about an inner sense of truth and false. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
Okay.
But I'm saying that it's going to immediately disqualify you from being meaningful, from being intelligible. Metaphysical, like on the ultimate grand scheme of things, if you do not first have a metaphysical framework. Moving from there, once you have one, of course you have to have the right one.
No. Wait.
If you're going to be speaking truthfully.
I need a clarification here, real fast. So you said it's impossible to be neutral towards God, and now you're bringing in additional qualifiers like meaningfully operating in the world or operating ultimately in the universe. These phrases are adding in context that was not in your original statement. So is your statement that in order to...
No, right now I'm justifying my claim. That's
right,
what you asked me to do.
Right. And in order to move meaningfully through the world or operate meaningfully through the world, we must have some kind of stance on God because you're adding in additional requirements here. Do you see what you're doing? You're adding in things like meaningful. And that could sway the decision one way or another as to whether or not we agree with you.
The assumption, which I wouldn't think would need to be stated, is that you at least believe that you're operating meaningfully in the world. I didn't think I'd need to qualify that, but I'm talking to you specifically, and I'm talking to Eric,
Hi.
with the assumption that at least you believe that you're operating within the world that is not in a way that is metaphysically arbitrary.
I don't know what any of these words mean.
Yeah, the way that I work with those, so here's the thing. I think that I'm operating with the best understanding of the world that I can, and I'm constantly improving it. And I do think it is arbitrary, but I think that all of it is to some degree arbitrary. And so because of that, I don't see how that's a disqualifier.
Well, by arbitrary, let me just make sure that we have a
Yeah.
clear definition of arbitrary, because I don't know if you'd want to make that statement. By arbitrary, I'm saying metaphysically arbitrary. I'm saying that there is no metaphysical frame of reference for things like truth or possibility or impossibility. So earlier I said that when you're dealing with a metaphysic, you're answering questions like, what does it mean for things to be true fundamentally, or possible or impossible,
Okay.
or like the fundamental relationship between them. If you're saying that you're operating arbitrarily, then you don't have like an answer to any of those questions,
Well,
which would be suicidal philosophically.
Well, I like the test you provided. So let's go with it for just a second, because I want to know if you determine whether or not something is true, right? I operate on the correspondence theory of truth. I think that if something corresponds to reality, it is true. That is how I determine whether or not a thing is true. I test it, and that's what I go with. When you're saying that I need some ultimate thing to compare it against, that doesn't really jive with my understanding of truth. And so,
well, let me just be clear. Frame of reference.
Yeah,
that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out kind of how you're seeing this, how you're viewing this, so that I can operate in that framework.
Well, I'll just give an example. So, I don't know if you might not like this, but I'm just going to give an example. So if somebody were to ask me what my metaphysical framework is, I'm going to tell them the Christian God, and that all truth is that which derives from the Christian God. All that is possible and impossible, the limits between those things are going to be by the Christian God, and God is ultimately the ground for all things that exist. All truth, right? That is what God is the ground for. Anything that is not in conformance with what God has said or what God is would be considered not the truth. That is my position. That is the position that I stand by. And so that's one. It's called the creator-creation distinction. God is ultimate. He's created all things. And that is one of many metaphysical frameworks that one person can have. Okay?
Okay.
So another framework would be something like if somebody wanted to say, and it's really kind of a non-framework, somebody would say something like, everything is a brute fact. There is no ultimate framework or mind or like frame of reference, that's going to ground any truth. It's just, everything's a brute fact. There is nothing that you could attribute to this fact as a cause for it. That's another example of a metaphysical framework. It's kind of a non-framework, a negation of a framework in that sense. Bottom line is that everyone has to have one if they're operating meaningfully in the world.
So what makes yours right? Because I'm assuming
what makes mine right?
I'm assuming that if you are convinced that your framework is the correct one, then you have good reason for that. What is that reason?
I believe that God has the properties that are required for knowledge and intelligibility and rationality. Again, this is my justification. Are you asking me now to justify God or to justify my original claim to you?
No, I'm asking you to justify God. I'm asking you why you think your framework is the correct one.
So, okay, I'll answer your question, but I want to make sure we have a resolution to what I called here for.
No.
You now agree? You now agree with my earlier statement that you cannot be neutral?
Robin, that's not what conversations are. You're not having a conversation with us. It's very clear you have a script and you're scared to get off of it. This is a conversation. We are granting you the benefit of having a conversation on this show. So have a conversation with us. We have gone here. This is where we're going now. Prove God to me, Robin. Why is your framework correct?
Okay. Yeah, so the Christian God, I don't know if you're familiar with transcendental reasoning, but it's reasoning to what is necessary for certain things to be the case. So an example of a transcendental argument would be something like, if a cake exists, then flour exists. That would be premise one. Premise two would be a cake exists. the conclusion would be that flour exists. The soundness of the argument can be put into question, but it's a valid argument. Okay, if a cake exists and flour exists, cake exists, therefore flour exists. That's a transcendental argument.
Right.
So that's what I use to justify if to somebody else the existence of God.
Okay,
God
but
has properties
I'm not
that are
worried.
required for intelligibility.
Okay, cool. That's
So
a valid argument.
So God has a set
Prove to me that it is sound. I will grant you right here, right now, that is a valid argument. It works out mathematically. Prove to me that it's sound. Because if it's not, or if you can't prove it, it's useless.
Yeah. He's asking you to evaluate the premises.
Yeah. So God has certain properties, and I can walk through the properties with you and show by reductio ad absurdum why, if God were to be deficient in any of his properties, that there would not be intelligibility. So for one, God is ultimate, okay, meaning that he is the foundation for all things. All things derive and depend upon God.
Flour is ultimate. All things are dependent upon flour.
No, the cake analogy was just a.
I know, I'm swapping out another word for it because I can make that claim just as easily as you can. Reductio ad absurdum necessitates that flour is the reason for everything. We are a giant cake, Robin, and if you don't believe that we are cake and you reject the reality of the ultimate flour, then you are unintelligible to me, and I don't know why we're having a conversation. Do you see where I'm getting?
I think you're trivializing and making a joke out of a serious argument, and I'm trying to present it to you, and that's I mean, I can just tell that's what you're trying to do.
No,
I'm trying to present it to you.
My point is that you can swap any word out for God and make these claims. My concern is that you have not proven the God part. I can't
I'm doing
prove
it right now. And as I was doing it, you started talking about flour.
No, it's a circular argument. I've heard this argument before. You have given it to me before. You are defining God by God's properties, and you cannot do that.
Isn't everything defined by its properties?
God is just the same. Is God hinging on the same logical requirements of everything else? Or does God play by special rules?
I don't even know what that question means.
Does God play by special rules, or are we holding God to the same logical frameworks as everything else?
Yeah, I just presented. I'm telling you right now, this is a transcendental reasoning, so it would be a logical argument. You just told me transcendental reasoning is valid. So I'm now trying to show you the soundness of the argument.
Right, exactly.
So yes, I'm presenting with you a logical, deductive argument now.
So if I might. With flour, we could say, okay, well, let's investigate the flour. We can get flour and we can determine its properties based on direct observation.
Right.
Without that, for
I thought
God,
you wanted to hear my argument.
I'm trying to back you up for a second. Wouldn't that be helpful?
I'd like to present my argument. If you think it's flawed, you're more than welcome to do that.
We're doing that right now.
I haven't actually presented you my argument.
Yeah,
I don't remember doing that.
Well, then that might need to be another call where it sounds like we have so much linguistic differences to work through.
Look, dude.
That's
well,
not,
my original point was not to just justify God to you, because I know it's a much longer conversation. It's actually much simpler to just explain to you why you cannot be neutral towards God, which is, I mean, I didn't come here to justify God's existence to you.
Right.
Why would we have any opinion on something you cannot justify and aren't interested in defining for us?
I did define it in the beginning. I did define God.
Okay. So
and actually the reason why we're talking right now is because you accepted that I defined God. So I did define him. That's why we're not even talking about definitions anymore. Because if you didn't accept the definition, we'd still be talking about it.
Well, we tried to be charitable, and we went, okay, Robin has an understanding of it and is operating on these assumptions, and we're trying to use Robin's definition.
Yeah, so I did define it for you. This is not an unclear definition. It's not controversial. In fact, if you ask any Western theist out here, I'm willing to bet you that the majority of them, whatever they believe, God, as I've defined it, would be consistent with their conception of God. Even if they're an agnostic or an atheist, they have this conception of God in their mind. I'm willing to wager that this is a conception of God that is not uncommon or controversial. That God is simply a mind, right? That's conscious, an agent or personal, that is ultimate. He created all things. This is not a complicated definition. I might be using terms, but I define them,
Robin,
in a way that is easy to understand.
Robin, saying it's not complicated doesn't mean it's not complicated. That is actually one of the most complicated definitions that I've ever heard.
People have this conception of God,
Robin,
I wouldn't call it complicated.
That's
Robin?
an argument ad populum, just so you know.
So
complicated is a statement in this regard. I'm taking complicated to mean a statement about the ability for somebody to wrap their head around something. If a billion people affirm a concept, if billions of people affirm a concept, then they should not have a hard time wrapping their head around it.
Wait.
Okay.
Right?
Billions of people believe in
concept.
gravity, but ask the average Joe Schmo on the street to define what gravity is and why it works, and you're not going to get a good answer.
Well, let's go to your God thing. You think billions of people accept that God is an ultimate foundation to reality and the underpinning under which
a metaphysical framework exists,
and that metaphysical framework is the only true framework by which any of us are actually using reasoning. Is that about right?
What I said was that God, people have a conception of God, irrespective of whether or not they believe in God, that would be consistent. Many people have a conception of God, billions, I said, that would be consistent with what I've just laid out here. That God is ultimately created all things, and that it's a mind. Okay. Now that's a very bare bones definition. But if you ask a Bible believing Christian, this is what a lot of them would say. Ask a Muslim, this is what a lot of them would say. Ask a Jew, and they take up the majority of the population of the earth.
Okay, got it.
Okay,
then I can respond to this.
Look, we're
Robin,
getting into the weeds here. All I'm doing is just
Robin,
whether or not you believe, whether or not you think most or many.
Robin, let me answer, dude.
Look, that's entirely
Robin,
issue, okay?
Let me answer. You just gave a really, really great piece that I needed in order to move forward. Robin, I actually personally am not neutral about that. I don't think that a mind could exist without a body. And because of that, I reject that outright. I'm not neutral. I reject it. Can somebody be neutral about it? It entirely depends on whether or not they think, it entirely depends on their concept of mind-body dualism. But I can speak for myself and say I am not neutral to that. A mind cannot exist without a body. And so because of that, not only do I reject your premise, I think that it is not possible for it to be true. So it doesn't even get to go to the grown-up table to sit down.
Okay. Do you have a justification for that?
Sure. Sure. Okay. Yeah. We have not yet gotten any kind of I think we need to justify that a mind can exist without a body before we can use that as a premise. And there are no minds that exist.
It's the what now?
Are you talking about an argument from ignorance?
Argumentum ad ignorantum, to say that something is false if it has not been proven to be true to you.
Right. So I get what you're saying, but you're making a positive claim. And I think that...
So are you.
Okay. So if you're going to say like black swan fallacy, right? Eric, you haven't seen a black swan. That doesn't mean that none exist, right? I think that it would be consistent for somebody who has never seen a black swan to rationally say no black swans exist, or at least not to my understanding of it, until such time as they are presented with evidence to the contrary. So
it's the null hypothesis.
Yeah.
Well, hold on a minute. It's not a null hypothesis because Eric just said that he is not neutral. He said that he believes positively that something is the case.
Right. So
if I have to present a logical argument for what I believe, then so do you.
Okay, perfect. So can I similarly say that unicorns exist? Just because you haven't seen one or heard of one doesn't mean that they don't exist, and to say that they don't exist is
a category error, because we're talking about something you can be neutral towards. Right now, even if you couldn't be neutral towards unicorns, you told me that you positively believe that they don't exist.
Right. So I'm exploring this with you. So yes, I in as much as I've investigated it, minds are a product of a body plus other things, right? Certain conditions need to be made. I don't think a mind exists when you're dead. And so now I'm going with that
earlier, because now you're telling me, as far as I know, or I haven't seen something, which is different from me saying that something is not true.
That is correct. I don't. Is there a way that we can test whether or not minds can exist without bodies? Because every test
that's not really relevant.
Actually, it is.
No, because
So
that would be relevant to what you're saying now, but not to what you said earlier.
so
Because we could say, for example, that we cannot test something outside of the observable universe. We cannot test that. That doesn't mean that there's nothing there.
well,
But you're making a positive claim
Even
that
if
there.
I told you that you cannot test it.
sure. So there are also unicorns, leprechauns, fairies, and anything else I could possibly imagine. There are, a million pink elephants outside of existence
There's
as well.
Jesus Aquaman.
Yeah, like all of those things are there. You can't prove it doesn't exist, and just because you can't accept.
But you're saying it doesn't exist. But so you're saying so hold on. You're saying you're making a statement of something you cannot prove.
No, you're right. I think I'm flexing on that, and you're right. I need to be a little bit more humble and say that, in my experience, I have not gotten any indication that a mind can exist without a body, and so I can't, make a deductive argument. I can only go inductive on that, and I think that that's kind of the limitation of what humans can do.
So wait, Robin, did you just prove that we can be neutral towards your claim? Because you seem to be arguing against the fact that we can't be.
No, all I'm doing is saying that Eric is probably more on. No, I'm not making the claim that you can be neutral. I'm making the claim that you cannot be neutral. Eric said that he is not neutral, but now
Right.
On examination, it seems like he's more on the neutral side. At least when it comes to making the statement one way or the other, it seems like that's not something he would probably do.
So I don't know about that. I think that there are some things that can't be deductively, done, right? The problem of induction, moving from, experience to what is, right? It's a leap that both parties need to agree to make before they can move forward. And if you're not agreeing that we can make deductive arguments, then that's fine. We can stay in the land of inductive, but let's just be super clear. You're also using inductive reasoning, by those standards.
No,
you're not using inductive reasoning.
Yes, I am. So what I told you, actually, you guys agreed that transcendental reasoning is valid, and so if I'm going to give you a transcendental reasoning, then that would be like a deductive argument.
Well,
you could argue the soundness of the argument, but if I give you something in the form, it would be valid.
Right. I think what V was saying was that modus ponens is a valid structure in logic, and using modus ponens, it can get you to, true conclusions.
A correct, mathematically proven structure. Sure.
Given true premises, not necessarily that the transcendental argument is sound, but that modus ponens is.
Right.
Yeah, so my argument, just to put it in I'm not going to go in depth here. My argument for God, I can, but I don't know if you have the time. But my argument for God is simply this: there needs to be a being, okay, that is ultimate, that's a mind, that's revelatory, it's always truth revealing, is relational, okay, that is all of these things, is eternal.
Why?
And that is consistent entirely and exclusively with the Christian God. That is my argument. Now, I can go into depth of that if you want me to, okay? But that is my position.
How did you determine that this must be?
So actually, here's the thing. Robin, I feel like we had a good kind of row here, but it's 12:30. We only have a half hour left, and you're our second call. Robin, you live in D.C. Can you just move to Austin, and we can just sit and
Please don't
argue with each other for days and days on end?
Maybe that might be a little expensive.
In the meantime, Robin, we're going to keep challenging your presuppositions, and know that every time you call in, that.
No, that's great.
There are a couple of times though that when you called in, we twice, or at least two times during this conversation, I stopped, I reflected, and I revised. Jumping in and saying, well, we need to move the conversation, didn't give me the opportunity to stop, reflect, and revise. And I want to make sure that we give people good examples of what that looks like.
Okay. Well, thanks again for taking my call. This was definitely enlightening.
I'm glad you think it was. Take care.
Do you see? I knew this was where it was going the entire time, and then I got there.
I know, but here's the thing. We need to have it out for the people to see it. Because
No,
if you're preempting it, then no one's going to see it had out.
Here's the deal. Robin calls in
Yeah.
with something that has nothing to do with his God claim. He gets us to make a positive statement about a God claim. And then he says, well, you just made a positive claim. Defend it. And we said, well, you also make a positive claim. Oh, we're not talking about that. You defend your claim. When I tried to get him to describe what God was and how we know that God is real, he was like, well, that's not what I called in about. We're getting off topic. No, that's the entire ballgame, because you are not willing or able to do that. And frankly, it's very disappointing to me to see that we're back at square one. Like, we've had 4 or 5 calls with this dude, and every single time he treats it like this is the first time he talks with us about something.
I've done this for 5 years. It's going to keep being step 1, and I don't mind it.
Well,
I know.
I do.
Well,
We'll see.
yeah.